Good afternoon. I'm the senior editor of Education Next, and in the latest issue of Education Next, the spring 2010 issue, our friend and colleague Andy Smarick has a terrific piece entitled Toothless Reform about the federal education stimulus funding and why it's not, according to him, generating very much reform. It's accompanied by fantastic artwork. Andy, besides the artwork, let's talk about the substance of what you basically contend in this piece that the federal government is more or less wasting $100 billion.
Well, I'd go a little bit less than that. So there were
99 billion.
About that. So there were $100 billion in the stimulus for education. About $20 billion was for higher education. So of the $80 billion that was K-12, most people think that this was an engine for reform, when in fact $75 billion of that was really just to prop up what states and districts had already been doing. So when people talk about the ARRA, they typically talk about race to the top. Well, that's $5 billion of $80 billion that we spend, and that $75 billion was really for just propping up old jobs and old programs.
So I can either see this glass as slightly full or largely empty. $5 billion in race to the top money sounds like a big number in its own right.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, $5 billion is more than any secretary has had at their discretion before. And Secretary Duncan, to his credit, is doing his best to make sure that states change laws and do reform-minded things in order to try to access that money. But I just wanted to make people realize that $75 billion is more than the Department of Education has ever had in 1 year before. And a lot of us thought, and Secretary Duncan wanted the states and districts to use this money in new, innovative ways. And according to the GAO and a handful of other reports, they didn't. They just used it to do what they were already doing.
But didn't Congress structure the $75 billion in ways that made it extremely unlikely that it would be used for reform? Didn't it just go out in formulas for same old, same old?
Exactly. That's one of the most interesting things, that if you want to have money do different things, don't send it out by formula, and don't send it out through Title I and IDEA, programs that have been around for 30 years or more and have led to certain results that certainly aren't the types of results that have overwhelmed or changed the system in any way. But having said that, $5 billion is more than we've had for reform before. So the big thrust of the article is trying to say, okay, $75 billion was wasted if you're really interested in reform as opposed to jobs, but we learned lessons from that $75 billion. Let's make sure we apply those lessons to the race to the top so it actually succeeds.
As of now, do you think they're applying the lessons?
Too soon to tell. I'm concerned, but it's really going to depend once the applications come in how tough Secretary Duncan and his team is willing to be. I mean, states and districts are desperate for money right now. Right now they would do just about anything to get their hands on $250, $300 million. It's going to be up to the secretary to say, no, your application isn't good enough. I don't trust that you're going to do good things with it. That's where the rubber's going to hit the road.
Your piece seems to call for a level of proof or evidence from states that I don't believe any federal agency has ever extracted from any state before, at least not in an honest way. Do you really think that it's realistic for a cabinet member, an education secretary, to expect states to essentially prove their sincerity, not just write the words down?
Well, we're talking about a lot of money, so I certainly hope that they would do that. But we actually really have to focus on the fact that the language of the law itself gave Secretary Duncan really no authority to do what he's done, which is tell states and districts, change your laws on charters, change your laws on data, change your laws on teachers. But he was bold enough that he did that. So now states have done that, and a lot of people are celebrating. So, for example, Tennessee raised their charter cap. We're all happy that's a good thing. But then if you go a level deeper, you have to see that 2 districts within the span of 2 days denied all 24 charter applications that were sent to them. So just because you have a good charter law doesn't necessarily mean that districts are going to implement it well. So this is why in the article I'm trying to point out, well, Governor Patrick in Massachusetts was a charter antagonist for years and years and years. Now that you put $4.5 billion on the table, all of a sudden he's changed his religion and he likes charters now. Do we really think that he and his team are going to be faithful to this, or are they just chasing the money?
Right, I see signs of that in Ohio as well,
true.
On the part of their forthcoming Race to the Top application, which they seem to be developing in cahoots with the teacher unions, even while promising to engage in the reforms that Duncan wants and that the unions want nothing to do with.
Well, there's a list that I made sure I did this in the article of 4 or 5 different quotes from state-based leaders, all of whom should be going after this money for reform, but their quotes indicate very clearly that they're really interested in the money, not the things that the money's supposed to accomplish. And if we know that that previous money money led to stabilizing the status quo, let's at least be skeptical when they promise us big things with this race to the top money.
Well, I'm skeptical for sure, and you're skeptical for sure, but your piece suggests a level of sort of possibility that the federal government might actually extract sincerity or conviction from states, not just lip service.
Well, Secretary Duncan, again, he and his team have been beating on the table saying, listen, if you're just trying to chase some money, that's not good enough. He has said several times that there are going to be more states that lose in the first round than win. And so it looks like he's doing what many of us would do, get tough up front, deny a lot of applications, make them go back to the drawing boards and promise more. Whether or not they do that is a big question, and whether or not Secretary Duncan and his team are really willing to tell a bunch of states, no, you're not going to get this money, even though Ohio has a multi-billion-dollar deficit and California has a $20 billion deficit. Their election coming up, and a lot of states want money. It's going to be a real test of their mettle.
You've fed right into my last question, which is when the senators start calling up the White House about their state being denied, is Secretary Duncan going to have the political ability to stick to his knitting when it comes to saying no to a bunch of states?
We have no reason to assume that he wouldn't. He keeps calling this a moonshot or an unprecedented opportunity. He's given every indication that he knows that this will never come around again, and this is really our chance to change the way states and districts do education. But I don't know, when two powerful senators and a governor call up and the White House has to worry about different things, you never know what the machinations within the government are going to be, but I think to his credit, he seems like he's going to stick to his guns. We'll see.
As you know, there are trade-offs above his pay grade. People wanting, do you really want my vote for the conference version of the health reform bill?
Right.
Yes.
So there are states that are definite front runners right now that everyone is talking about, and then there are a bunch of states that are kind of in the middle that are on the fence, and those are some pretty powerful states like the Ohio's and the Pennsylvania's and the New York's. Time will only tell. But to their credit, like I said, they realize that this is not going to happen again. They'll never have $4.35 billion to hand out for reform. Except
maybe next year when Congress renews it.
Well, there is talk. The department actually seems to be interested in doing things like I-3, the sister program to this, and Race to the Top again. Secretary Duncan seems to like the idea of competitive grant programs, moving the department in that direction. So he'll probably never get $4.35 billion again, but it's not unreasonable to think that they might get several $100 million to do competitions for new programs.
Well, on behalf of Education Next, thank you very much for another terrific piece, as well as for today's conversation.
Thanks for having me.